So we're all here to learn about the Salish Sea. But what is the Salish Sea? Think about technology to work? Okay. Here is the Stephen Freeland map of the Salish Sea. And this map is probably the most widely used image to represent the Salish Sea. And it's interesting for a few reasons. One is it has removed the U.S.-Canadian border. Two, it's incorporating three previously described as distinct bodies of water: Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Strait of Georgia. Prior to the term Salish Sea, if we want to talk about this whole bioregion, which you can imagine if you're a salmon or an orca, you're not like, oh, I'm now in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, oh, now I'm crossing the Strait of Georgia, so now I'm going to behave differently in this completely different body of water. It's a continuous body of water that's sharing the same physical and biological properties, meaning that if you're an orca, it doesn't matter. Your life is the same if you're in the Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, or the Strait of Georgia. But if we think about these and manage these as three distinct bodies of water, we're really not doing service to that biology and ecology and the physical nature of these bodies of water. So there's a very practical reason to think about this area as a single unit as opposed to three distinct units. But this boundary, this line where the map gets a little bit darker from a little bit lighter, this boundary extends beyond the salt water. So when you say the Salish Sea, we're not just talking about the marine environment, we're also talking about the terrestrial environment surrounding it. In fact, this boundary line is drawn right on the watershed, meaning that if you're a drop of water and you fall anywhere in the dark section of the map, you wind up falling into the Salish Sea. If you're a drop of water and you fall on the light side of the map, then you move out somewhere else. So it's an interesting way of thinking about place, both from a biological and ecological perspective of these three separate water bodies, Strait of Georgia, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound, as not completely separate, but a connected ecosystem, which makes sense from an ecological and biological perspective, but also bringing in the upland environment. Because if you want a healthy marine environment, you also have to have a healthy watershed. So those two are intrinsically linked. And so this map is showing that as well. But now it's called the Salish Sea and surrounding basins. It's not called the Strait of Juan de Fuca / Georgia plus Puget Sound. It's given this separate name, the Salish Sea. And that's done to also recognize and acknowledge that this part of the world is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. The Salish people, the Strait Salish and the Coast Salish. And so this name does two things. One, it recognizes the original inhabitants of the area, and it also removes this geopolitical boundary of U.S.-Canada, and it actually draws a map that is more ecologically and biologically correct. And the Salish Sea is a really pretty amazing place. Throughout this area we have almost 7,500 kilometers of coastline, almost 420 islands. The population in the Salish Sea is about 8 million people, so it's a massively densely populated area. And we'll go into population lecture later and talking about the differences between U.S. and Canada. We're really biologically diverse. We have 37 different species of marine mammals, 172 species of birds, 253 species of fish, and then more than 3,000 species of invertebrates, including 113 of those which are threatened, endangered, or candidates for listing. We have some of the biggest and oldest species in the Salish Sea. You can think about cedars that are hundreds of years old. So it's a really interesting area from that perspective as well. This is another map of the Salish Sea. This is put out by the Sea Society, and it shows some of the major cities in the area as well. So I can move my head out of the way. From Olympia, Seattle, Bellingham, Vancouver, all the way up to Campbell River. So the Salish Sea, the northern extent of the Salish Sea, is typically thought of as about Quadra, all the way down through Olympia, and then out on the outer coast here. Now, if we contrast that to what does the Salish Sea look like from a different perspective, if we look at it, so this is the central Salish Sea, so this is kind of a zoom in of where we're at here. So you can see the overall extent of the Salish Sea, but this is kind of the area that perhaps we're most familiar with. And it's really interesting from kind of a social and marine research perspective, is that once we remove this U.S.-Canadian border, things look a little bit different, and your eyes more drawn to thinking about Victoria. Victoria actually being a fair amount south of Bellingham. So we often think of Canada as like north, but actually the southern tip of Vancouver Island is south of us. And I've done a fair amount of research over here in the southern Gulf Islands. And while they're about 30 miles as the crow flies from Bellingham, we have to go all the way up north, take a ferry, and come all the way, loop back around to get to Salt Spring Island here. So it's like this massive journey because of this international border doesn't let us pass directly east to west. So it's very interesting to think about it from that perspective, is that this border really alters the way that we move. And this border alters the way that Coast Salish people can move, where we'll look at in a few additional maps of how these territories were throughout the islands, and now they've been bisected, and people have been cut off from their traditional homelands by the U.S.-Canadian border. So here's the map again. This is a Google map showing that international border. You can see how it just bisects, just goes right through the islands, kind of zigzags back and forth, and goes south and splits the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So we're up here in Bellingham. Victoria's a fair amount south. Due west of us, again, is Salt Spring, Fulford Harbor, where I've worked for a few years. But this border makes it really hard for folks that live out here to just cross the border and visit, engage, harvest, collect, do ceremony in their traditional territories, because now you have to go through this international border, and we'll talk about some of the legal ramifications of that. One of those ramifications, move my head again here, is the way that harvest management's done and the way that treaties are acknowledged and operate. So one interesting story is if you compare and think about the Lummi tribe, which are our neighbors over here, and the Semiahmoo band, which are just north of the border. Traditionally, Semiahmoo's territory would extend much further south into Washington, but they wound up being on the north side of the line, and so now their rights and title are a fair amount different, as well as the ecological way that we handle shellfish harvest and water quality. And so in Boundary Bay, which is the boundary between Canada and the U.S., on the northern side of the line, on the Canadian side of the line, shellfish harvest has been closed since 1962. On the southern side of the line, shellfish harvest has been open conditionally, which means it's open during certain parts of the year. It's typically associated with freshwater flow and fecal coliform issues. But it's actively managed where shellfishing is allowed, collection of clams is allowed during certain times of the year, and other times when it's not safe, it's closed. But you're allowed to harvest shellfish on the U.S. side of the line since 2004. However, on the Canadian side of the line, the same water that sloshes back and forth every day, If you happen to be on the Canadian side, you're not legally not allowed to harvest shellfish. And this has played out when one summer a number of the Lummi tribal members were out digging shellfish and nothing happened. They went out, they practiced their inherent rights, meaning rights that you are born with. They were practicing their inherent rights, collecting shellfish, collected those shellfish, went home. A few members of the Semiahmoo band were doing the same thing in Boundary Bay, and they were arrested and charged with illegal shellfish harvest. And this is because the way that Canada both manages shellfish is different, and also the treaty rights are different in Canada. So this line has a very real impact for the indigenous populations living just north of it and just south of it. That because they wound up now in a different political environment, their inherent rights are being infringed upon both ecologically and legally. Ecologically meaning that there's a fair amount of pollution coming down that's making some of these shellfish beds unsafe, and that's not pollution generated from within the reserve, that's external pollution that's coming down and harming their ability to harvest. Where in the U.S., because of the Point Elliott and Stevens treaties, the tribe has legal rights to harvest and has legal rights to uphold environmental qualities to assure that harvest. Things are a fair amount different. So it's an interesting story where you look at both sides of this line, and we'll explore this in greater depth, but we'll look at both sides of this line and how it has a real impact for people that are doing the same thing at the same time. One winds up having a beautiful day on the beach, collects some clams, and the other one winds up in jail. So if we move back and think about what the Salish Sea looked like prior to colonization, we can start to look at some of Wayne Suttle's work. Now, granted, his work was done in the 40s, and he was interviewing elders at that time, but he was really interested in what were people's ancestral areas and where they existed for thousands of years. And this map is really interesting because then you can start to see things like Semiahmoo just kind of occupied this large area. Here, Lummi, sort of here, Samish, my tribe, sort of southern, eastern San Juans, Saanich, which would have extended over this way as well, Songhees, which would have been kind of southern San Juan Island, as well as Nawaha, a tribe that's not talked about much, that has fought for federal recognition but not been awarded yet, Upper Skagit, Swinomish, Nooksack. And so you can start to see where all of a sudden you're cut off from both your close relatives, but also people would have moved back and forth across these areas. It's not a very far paddle to get from the peninsula here over to the islands. It's it's an easy day trip to get over here and stay for a while. But now all of that's changed because we have to go through this border. Here's a inset of the territory for Semiahmoo. So you can see that now their small reserve is just sort of up here on Boundary Bay. Their full territory extends all the way down past Birch Bay, so down to kind of near Cherry Point, back around. And this shows a lot of their harvest areas as well, where people would catch salmon, where they dig for clams, where they would have their winter villages, look for camas, things like this. It's pretty interesting to think about how that's really changed and how they're now cut off from really the vast majority of their territory, right? So most of their territory would have been south of the line. So that presents a fair number of legal issues. And here's a similar map for Lummi. Now lines always get a bit contentious, and so these are dotted lines, but talking to a fair number of folks, these are pretty good representations of the traditional territory of the Lummi people. And similar to the Semiahmoo map, it shows areas where people went for collection and harvest. And you see that that territory includes Bellingham, Lemmy Island, a good chunk of the San Juans, a good chunk of Orcas, San Juan, northern part, western part of Lopez. Then Samish would have been more centered down here. And this reference, Suttles 1951, is a great one. It's his doctoral thesis, actually, from the University of Washington. And it's one of the most cited documents for kind of pre-contact life in this part of the world. Now I want to pause here and I'll jump over to this website here in a second and encourage you to go look it up as well. native-land.ca. It's a really cool map that shows territories in a different context. So now instead of modern political boundaries, we can start to look at territories, and you can start to see the central Salish Sea where we're at is really densely populated, lots of overlapping territory, kind of all throughout the Salish Sea. That it's a very diverse area with many, many, many different cultures and people sharing these lands and waterways. So it's a really complex environment, both ecologically and physically, but also culturally and socially. That this massive diversity of habitat is also home to a massive diversity of people. And so this is looking at this area with just looking at people's territories. And we can also look at the same map looking at languages. And so you can see again there's a couple overlapping languages here, but there's also many shared languages between different communities. So Hokkamiam, and then you often see Sinchothan a little further south here. I'm going to pause and jump over to that Native Lands website. So this is the nativeland.ca, and you can see that they've built this map out over large parts of the world, and I want to zoom in first and looking at the kind of larger North America here, and you can see that there's again a vast number of cultures and territories throughout the area, which is also represented by a vast number of languages. And I think what's interesting when we're thinking about the differences between U.S. and Canada is if we look at the number of treaties. So you can see in the eastern U.S. there were very few treaties signed. In the western U.S. a fair amount more. In Canada it's largely the opposite, where they have large treaties in the east and central Canada, but on the west shockingly few treaties. So if we can zoom in and think about the Salish Sea here, we can see that there's a fair number of treaties, mostly these are all called Stevens treaties, but the Treaty of Point Elliott, Point No Point Treaty, encompass this area. For Canada, there's a couple Douglas treaties, but most of the tribes or First Nations or bands in Canada are not operating with a treaty. They are undergoing modern day treaty negotiations, and so the government's occupying unceded lands, meaning that the First Nations never gave up their rights and title to those lands, but they've been taken, and there's not been an agreement around that. So we'll go on that a bit deeper with treaties, but I think it's really remarkable to think about how that political boundary then relates to people's ability to practice inherent rights. Things that are aspects of people's inherent rights are protected on the U.S. side, but not on the Canadian side. And so again, when I say inherent rights, I mean your birthright. As an Indigenous person, you have an inherent right to go out, collect and harvest and practice your traditional practices without interference from the government. Some of those inherent rights are codified and protected within a treaty right. So a treaty right is a subset of inherent rights that are codified, and the practicing of those inherent rights is now legal under that framework, under that treaty. In Canada, the vast majority of First Nations do not have that. They have some protections for ceremonial and subsistence harvest, but not to engage in commercial activities to the same extent that U.S. tribes do, nor do they have the same management and co-management setup. So it's vastly different across that border. And so while this is one continuous, unique ecological area with a lot of unique and related cultures, that U.S.-Canadian boundary has very real impacts for the way that people are able to practice their inherent rights. So it's a brief overview of the Salish Sea, and just to kind of get in the context of where we are in the world, the terms that we're going to use, the 3 different basins are important to know, and some of the differences across the border between the treaties. In subsequent lectures, we're going to go a lot deeper into many of the aspects we talked about, but we're just trying to get a kind of brief overview to all get on the same page about when we say Salish Sea, where are we talking about? Like, what is this? Where does it exist?